Good morning, everyone. Bienvenidos. It's just lovely to look around the room and see so many old faces, familiar faces, as well as new faces. It's just a pleasure to be here. I have the honor of introducing Diana Campoamor, who's the president of Hispanics in Philanthropy. But I wanted to share a little information before I do that. And that is that Hispanics in Philanthropy, or HIP New Mexico, was actually born in this very room. Some of you remember Stephen Patrick, who was with the Daniels Fund at the time, and Susan Herrera from the Lano Foundation. Well, Diana and her team came up with this amazing idea of establishing a funders collaborative for stronger Latino communities. Stephen Patrick went to a conference, I believe, and heard about it, came back really excited, told Susan Herrera, who got a number of us together in this room, and I'm pleased to say that at the time I was with the Santa Fe Community Foundation, and we were one of the first, other than the Lano Foundation, to sign up for that 9-year Funders Collaborative, which did amazing work. So in terms of Hispanics in Philanthropy, they've had a presence in New Mexico for over 13 years, since I think 2002. First with the Funders Collaborative for Stronger Latino Communities, and some of you in this room, I see Lisa, I see others have been a part of that. And then more recently with the Men and Boys Initiative that a couple of us continue to be a part of. Diana has been with Hispanics in Philanthropy from almost the beginning. HIP celebrated its 30th anniversary in 2013. And Diana, I think you started in 1991, so that's almost 25 years. So does this lady love her job or what? How many of us can say that? So under Diana's leadership, HIP has invested over $40 million in small Latino nonprofits and leaders in 19 different states in both the US and Latin America. Prior to joining HIP, Diana worked at the Shalon Foundation, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and the United Way. Her book of essays, some of you may know this, Nuevos Senderos, Hispanics and Philanthropy, was one of the first anthologies to portray Latinos as givers and leaders in philanthropy. That was a really breakthrough essay or anthology. Thank you for doing that. She has received many honors and awards and has been listed for the past 5 years as one of the 100 most influential Latinas or Latinos by Latino Leaders magazine, who also awarded her the prestigious Maestro Award for Philanthropy in 2008. She's a native of Cuba, a US citizen, bilingual and bicultural, and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, where one of the offices of Hispanics in Philanthropy, the main office, I believe, is located. Diana is a visionary. Those of you that know her know that she's a ball of energy. She is one of my role models and mentors. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Diana.
Dolores, you forgot to mention, our aging initiative, and the health initiative. It's kind of beginning to forget that now, right?
I'd be there all day if I talked about everything you said.
Right. Well, it's great to be here with you, and I have good news. Let me see if I can I take this mic off, or not? I guess not. I guess it's connected to this. All right. What I really want to do, when Kathy called me and invited me to come here, and just New Mexico is just one of my favorite places, and I have learned so much from the work that we have done here. It's been priceless. It has informed HIP's work throughout the country. So, I have to say, thank you to all of you, that have been part of that learning and, part of that collective effort. But when Kathy invited me to come and talk with you, she said that she wanted for me to talk about equity, right? And, my assumption is that all of us who are part of this work, are thinking about equity, and we're thinking about inequality, and, we're thinking, what are, the consequences of that? A lot has been written in the past many, many years about it, and part of what I want to do is I want to have a conversation with you about what is it, why it matters, what it looks like here in New Mexico, and how do we get past it? Or at least, I was talking with Ona earlier, and we were saying that, that transformation takes so much time. And sometimes in a lifetime, you don't get it done. But the question is, were you there to be part of the solution in the space and time that you had? Many, many years ago, I heard George Soros, the famous philanthropist, talk about the difference between his business and his philanthropy. And he said, in my business, it's very easy to figure out if I was successful or not. How much money did I make? Did I meet my objectives? He said, in my philanthropy, all I need to know, is that I was consistent with my values. And so, in his case, to be a part of helping to support democracy in Eastern Europe, even though it didn't necessarily accomplish what he wanted, but the fact that he was part of that, that was success to him. Raise your hand if you know what equity is. Everybody knows what equity is. Okay. And how is it different from equality? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Yeah?
Equality is where everything is equal.
Mm-hmm.
Equity is where one size does not fit all, and you make adjustments based on social conditions.
There you go. Thank you. Another way to look at it is, in a race around an elliptical track, equality would require that all runners start at the same place. That would mean that people on the inner edge have an advantage, and those on the outer edge, have a disadvantage. But of course, if you start, in a staggered way, then everyone has, equal opportunity. So equity requires that runners be staggered, and equity is the means. Equality, of course, is the result. And I think, all of us came into this field, because we recognized that these were the issues of our time, in a place like New Mexico. How many of us have spent a lifetime, working for social justice, and what does that mean? So in thinking about this conversation this morning, I was reminded that a number of years ago, I read a book, perhaps some of you have read it, called Ethics for the New Millennium. It was the little book that the Dalai Lama wrote about, how do you get to a place of peace? And the reason I bring peace is because I think without equity, there will be no peace, right? And, he discussed the different hotspots, and conflicts, and I think you see them. I saw them last night in the evening news. And at the end, he said, peace will come because of commissions of citizens of conscience. Government has, of course, a very big role, and so does the private enterprise system. Businesses are about, generating work and profit. governments, about policies and rules, and hopefully rules that, are good for all of us, although not always. But the commissions, the citizens, philanthropy, the third sector has, the ability to energize, a reflective discourse on why equality and equity matter. And there has certainly been a lot written on that. Many of us got into this sector. I know, as a young woman, I started working in, somebody that thought I was going to have a career as a journalist. And by the way, I think grant making is indeed, a career for a journalist, because it's about going out there and listening to people and hearing the story. The difference with a journalist is that, of course, you report the story. A philanthropist has the privilege of being part of the story, being supportive of the solution. And, but I think the skills are very similar. So the third sector, and all of us here as citizens of conscience, are the glue, the energy and the attention that can get us, number one, to talk about equality and equity and why it matters to us. So we are the glue and the energy behind this discourse that indeed changes policies, that advocates for better policies. I remember coming here in the early 2000s, and I remember a Robbie Rodriguez without gray hair who was working at SWAP. And I remember Paula Gomez, at the New Mexico Acequia Association. And I remember many folks that were at that point working in small and large organizations, but it was the energy of their attention and their reflective discourse that was making changes in this community, that was bringing home, why it was important for New Mexico to have a strong civil sector, a strong third sector, why philanthropy played such a critical role. We play roles in resolving conflicts, Enlace, La Placita, and many others that are doing work on men and boys of color. We nurture our creativity. This is an amazing state for the arts. But is that art about selling products? Or is that art a human right? The human right to experience and to express your creativity, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're in the gallery or simply in an after-school program. The ability to develop our own narrative is as important as bread and water. We evolve. Part of the role of philanthropy is to help each one of us evolve past our own mental clutter and stereotypes to find the one unifying theme, and that's our shared humanity. In politics, there's a number of examples where the third sector has made huge changes. As Dolores mentioned, I'm from Cuba. I came here when I was 11 years old and I didn't speak English. I sat in a classroom at a public school in New Orleans at a time when schools were not desegregated. In fact, my parents had to show an affidavit to the effect that I was white in order for me to be admitted. I tell these stories to, my kids and my grandkids, and they can't believe that it's in my lifetime that these changes, have happened. And all of a sudden, the Pope comes in and talks to Obama and to Raul, and 54 years, of animosity, go down the drain. I think that is the power, of the third sector. In Israel, I watched the news last night. the Secretary General of the United Nations, is in the Middle East because of the conflict. And I remember years ago, I was invited to go on one of these delegations that is organized by a group called Project Interchange. And what struck me most was, that there were groups of Israeli and Palestinian women, many of whom had lost children in these wars, that would march together for peace against, the Palestinian Authority, as well as the Knesset and the Israeli government, there you go, peace. I don't know if any of you, follow what happens in Latin America, but decades ago, in the 1980s, the country of Argentina had a very brutal dictatorship. And that dictatorship, which lasted, for a number of years, literally disappeared almost 30,000 people. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. A group of women called Madres de Plaza de Mayo went out banging on their pots and pans day in and day out, and they were the tipping point that overthrew that dictatorship. And there have been a number of books and films done about them. So I think we have that power. And finally, in our movie theaters and in our bookstores, the story of Malala. The story of Malala, the Nobel Prize winner, and the ability of women in places like Afghanistan and India and others to speak out and change the role and the stereotype of women. Our industry, philanthropy, has many, many inspiring stories as well. How many of you have seen the movie Selma or Mississippi Burning? That's right. All of these stories about the civil rights. I remember being in a theater years and years ago, and all of a sudden thinking, who funded all those students that went down there to organize those voters? Who was funding those public interest law firms, that were going to the Warren Court to change the laws in 1964 and 1965? Well, you know what? It was the Ford Foundation and many individual donors and churches and others that fueled that movement that gave us the laws that are in place today, that have changed things dramatically in my lifetime. In addition to the Ford Foundation, which today, by the way, focuses still on inequality, the Kellogg Foundation and its work on racial equity is incredibly, incredibly thoughtful, because it recognizes that some of us in the outer edge of that racetrack need to find a way to be staggered, that it's not all a level playing field. And I'm so glad that Barbara Ferrer is going to be with you a little bit later on. Marguerite Casey Foundation, the movement building work that they are doing, focusing on low-income families who know, what the solutions to their issues are. We don't need to come from the top to find solutions for people who are incredibly energetic and thoughtful and who know, what the solutions for their issues are. Despite our best efforts, and despite the work that many of you here do, and national foundations partner with you, and the work that we do and the collaboratives that we create, the United States has the highest Gini index, the index of inequality, followed by Great Britain and Canada. We have the highest inequality. And what is difficult is that we think of ourselves as a place of opportunity. This is the place of the American dream. Yet we have this dissonance between what we say and what we think and what actually happens. It costs us thousands and thousands and millions and billions of dollars, but it more importantly cost us lives and lost opportunity and happiness and creativity. We all know that in New Mexico it costs more than $35,000 a year to incarcerate a person and $10,000 to educate them. We know that in this Gini index, the southern part of the state has less inequality, and I wish I had brought that slide that shows, where the areas of highest inequality are. They're mostly in the South, for many reasons, in part, because of race and culture and, a number of issues. But if you look at the state of New Mexico, less inequality in the South, more inequality in the North. So in his book, The Price of Inequality, Joseph Stiglitz argues that this growing income inequality is responsible for all manner of political instability, as well as a slowing economic growth. We have seen it in this past year, the Black Lives Matters movement. The number of issues and the number of lives that are being lost as a result of this. One last study, the Pew Research, a couple of years ago did a study in 44 countries and asked respondents in those countries, what is the greatest threat to the world? And people in most countries said, religious and ethnic hatred. In the United States and in Europe, people said inequality. That is the greatest threat. So there's clearly, a dissonance between what we're seeing and thinking and our values and what is actually going on in our communities. Last, Robert Putnam's new book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. Putnam, the guy who talked about why the third sector, is important, why it's important that we have a sense of being connected, being one unit. He said, the Port Clinton, Ohio, that I grew up in the 50s, my hometown was a passable embodiment of the American dream. 60 years later, it is a split-screen American nightmare. So something is happening. Something has happened from the 50s to now, and we all have the burden of that inequality. I would be remiss, of course, if I did not show you some statistics from HIP, from our own work here in New Mexico and elsewhere, and I'll be, very quick, but let me just say, I've worked in philanthropy now for both at HIP and at other foundations for 25 years. And the issue of underfunding of certain groups has remained so intractable. So in 2011, we asked the Foundation Center, and the Foundation Center, of course, is our industry, keeper of the data. We asked the Foundation Center to look up the data on the last 10 years of funding to Latino organizations at a time when the population had grown by 49%. And let me show you. Look at where it's been, okay? Less than 2%, approximately 1%. But it's not just about Latinos. It's about women, it's about, African Americans, it's about the disabled, it's about, the LGBT community. It's about American Indians, you know. It's about all those people that are on the outside of that elliptical track. Racial and ethnic minorities, women and girls. So this is the regional, you know, the regional breakdown, you know, where most of it, of course, you know, in California. Not as much in the Midwest. Anyhow, I say this, well, in part, you know, because I'm here and I have to talk a little bit about, you know, my little corner, you know, of philanthropy, but because I believe that it's a systemic issue. And there are ways, you know, that we can manage that. In 2012, after releasing this report, I, you know, went around and talked to a variety of heads of foundations, and we had very different reactions. The typical reaction was, the data is flawed. And indeed, the data shows trends. It's not perfect, you know. But no, you know, I give a lot of money, you know, to Latino, or, you know, I fund the public schools in Denver, and 20% of the public schools are, you know, Latino, and that's not me, basically. That's not me, that's not my, you know, foundation. But I had one incident that I wanted to share with you this morning because I thought it was very hopeful. There was this one foundation, offices in mid-Manhattan, tall white guy, you know, probably in his 50s or 60s, you know, blue eyes, Midwesterner, you know, sat down with me and said, you know, when I saw this report, I said, that's just a, you know, propaganda ploy from those people at HIP. And so I asked my staff to do a survey. And what I found was that you are right. My foundation is one of those foundations. And fast forward, you know, 3 years later, his guidelines have changed. There are 2 Latino program officers on his staff where there were none. His board is more diverse. And, you know, his outcomes have changed. But it took, you know, that, you know, first of all, I think it took, you know, a great deal of courage because to not defend himself and his organization. And to think, you know, that this was important enough that, you know, he could put his, you know, his reputation on the line, or, you know, the foundation's reputation. That, you know, he could say, well, you know, maybe I am wrong. Or maybe it's not about right or wrong. Maybe I can do, you know, maybe I can do better. So I think that there are many stories like that, and, you know, I see them all the time. I think the good news is that over the past 15, 16 years, you know, this word and this concept of transformation, you know, transformative learning, you know, transformative organizations has taken root. And I think the reason why we have a language for it is because there is an urgency to it. The internet, the media, you know, the fact that we are so connected means that we cannot tolerate the dissonance between our values and the policies and behaviors that are out there. So this is driving us to become the catalyst for that transformation that I believe will lead to equity and equality. Let me just share with you, you know, a couple of ideas. Philanthropy Northwest and the Russell Family Foundation in particular has said transformative philanthropy is systemic, collaborative grant making with an eye towards long-term change. I was sharing with Dolores and a few of you that when I started at this job, I thought that by year 5, I was going to be able to do, tick it off, right? And it's only after year 20 that I have seen some of those seeds begin to take hold and to sprout. So philanthropy is a very strategic place from which to work on equity, and a very inspiring place, and a very collegial place from which to find these solutions, from which to imagine this transformation. And so, with the bells in the background, good soundtrack, I want to come back to, the issue of peace and equity. And, that old adage, let there be peace in the world, and let that peace begin with me. If we want equity and equality, it has to begin with me. It has to begin with me, and it has to begin with you. And philanthropy is the best place from which we can be a part of that solution. Thank you.